Well, welcome everybody. Glad you made it back to our second week of Evangelism 101. Let's go ahead and begin this evening with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God of all the nations of the earth, remember the multitudes who have been created in your image, but have not known the redeeming work of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And grant that by the prayers and labors of your holy church, they may be brought to know and worship you as you have been revealed in your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, again, welcome back, everybody. And thank you to all of you that submitted your stories. It was really fantastic to get a chance to, and holy, to just read your stories and what you experienced. I'm curious, how did it feel to write down your own story with God and share it with somebody else? I would love for you to just take a moment to jot that down in the chat, what that felt like to you. But if you'd like to just unmute and chime in now, how did it feel to write down your story and share it with somebody? We'd love to hear some of your reflections. Anybody want to start? Yeah, Rhonda.
I can't find my my computer hand, so I'll wave my own hand. The last time I did this was maybe 2005, something like that. I did a spiritual autobiography, and the difference between then and now was just astounding. At that point, I was still suffering from many spiritual connections that had been cut off unexpectedly and left me feeling a bit stranded and alone.
Yeah.
And in the ensuing 15 years or so through the church, through Curcio, I've just been so blessed. And it just came across this time there as just one continuous blessing. It was very interesting, the contrast between the two events over a decade and a half or so.
I'm glad you had the opportunity to reflect on it in that way, Rhonda. That's really great. And it is true, right? That we have peaks and valleys in our spiritual experience. And so sometimes it's helpful to reflect on use these types of exercises to reflect on our experience so that we can name those peaks and valleys and be grateful for when things are really different than when they were in the shadows of life. Joseph, you put your hand up. How about you?
I very much struggled with this activity, both because to sort of go through my own faith journey seems like more of a multi-hour conversation, but also just that when I'm trying to communicate to people why I think they should be part of the church, I feel like I do that much better in conversation than in a couple hundred words just written down. So it's like both on my own personal level, it was hard to figure out what to say, but also just like this is not the medium that I'm the most comfortable with talking about it. So Absolutely. It was definitely a challenge.
Yeah, well, thank you for being willing to name that. And that's absolutely the case for some of us. Some of us are way more comfortable with conversational processing, verbally processing with people our experience and having a dialogue with others about it. But for others, sometimes it's just helpful to have that moment to sit quietly and reflect on our own story and where God has been present in it. Yeah, Susan, you've got your hand up. And thank you for sharing your story.
Oh, thank you. I have also written a spiritual autobiography before and was actually asked to do a stand-up at one of my parishes about, how I got where I got. And I had incorporated some of those things in, but that was a long time ago and things have happened since then. And I found that, well, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure why I signed up for this class. And I really wasn't. I just, had that little voice in my heart that said, you're supposed to be there. And I do struggle to explain my spirituality to members of my family. And I said, well, maybe this will help
Yeah.
because them are unchurched. Not that all of us didn't grow up in the church, but many have fallen away. But nonetheless, what I wanted to share was in writing my story, I realized that I had a mission that I had been feeling, but I hadn't really been able to express before. And that was what you responded to when you sent your note back to me. And that is finding God in nature and using nature to communicate God's beauty. And behind me is a picture from a retreat that my husband and I took last fall to the island of Iona with John Philip Newell. And that I am taking that from the abbey that's at Iona there. There's an old house that was still standing. So I just took this picture and I loved it. And it kind of brought back to me the feelings that I had while I was in Iona, was being able to find God in nature as the Celts did, and as John Philip Newell has taught. And I don't know if any of others of you had been to his presentation to the Diocese about 2 years ago, but it really turned my heart and captured me. So I feel like that's where I need to be expressing and talking about my trip, my journey, my closeness to God.
Love it, Susan. There's two things that come to mind as you share. The first is that there is a group of people across the diocese doing something called chaparral chapels, which is all about experiencing God out in nature on hikes. And even one of those groups is doing a Eucharist out on the hikes. So that is a group that you might want to check out. There's also a really great book on how Patrick evangelized the Celts. I can't remember the title of the book, but it's by George G. Hunter. It's a fantastic book. It really is just a simple, short read, but really great insights into that kind of perspective based on sharing about Newell. So something you might want to check in.
Thank you.
Yeah. So speaking about spiritual experiences and practices, we're going to try out a prayer practice that is all about evangelism, quite frankly. And it may not at first glance be something that looks like evangelism, but it has a deep connection to it. Has anybody here heard of the practice of the examen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see some hands going up, some nods. Well, we're going to talk about the examen, because the examen actually is a fantastic practice of not only noticing God at work in our own lives, but in the world around us. And the examen actually is a prayer practice that begins with looking at the last 24 hours of our lives and observing where God has been at work there. There's a few things that we do when we're practicing the examen. We try to quiet ourselves and be still so that we can pay attention in our review or examination of the last 24 hours, the last day. We give thanks for where God has shown up in our lives, and we say sorry for those opportunities that God may have brought us in the last 24 hours that maybe we didn't participate in, we didn't say yes to. And we also acknowledge those moments that we're proud of, not just apologize, but we acknowledge those moments where we did participate in the opportunities that God brought us in the last 24 hours. We set a goal for how we want to participate with God in the coming day, and we say a prayer related to our observations, our examination of the last day. So we're going to go ahead and try the examen together this evening. And so I want, serious friends, what was that examen experience like for you? Thanks for sharing, Shan. Well, all of this is kind of leading us to where we're headed next with the coursework. And some of you asked about this in your exchanges around you sharing your stories is, okay, I think I have an understanding of my story and what that looks like for me to express it, but how do I have conversations with others about that? And that's what we're going to be getting into this evening, is talking a little bit more about what it looks like to share God's story. And it doesn't look like this. I will say that much. It doesn't look like this kind of sharing God's story, but you've all seen and heard this kind of idea of hell and damnation is God's story being shared. But I'd actually like to pull from scripture a different analogy for what it looks like for us to share what God is up to, not only in our own lives, but in the world around us. And to start that off, it might be helpful to take as an analogy for our conversation, the story of Adam, when God is bringing before Adam all of the created creatures that God has made in the world. And we see this image in Genesis 2, where God brings before Adam all of the created world that God has made. And in this story, what Adam does is Adam sees each of these beautiful, amazing creatures that God has made and gives name to each of them. We don't create good news, friends. What we do is we get to notice and with wonder, give name to what God is doing in the world. Like Adam, we get to step back and see what God is up to in the world and say, wow, that is amazing. God made that. God did that. And that's a giraffe or whatever it may be in our experience. But giving name to what God is doing in the world, noticing it. So in our own stories, in our own experiences, where do we start? Where do we begin sharing God's story and our own experiences? Well, if some of you participated in the Easter Invitation workshop some months ago, some of this may be a bit of a repeat for you. But what I'd like to share with you is kind of an idea of where to start. Not with complete strangers like that ugly guy at the beginning of this segment that's just pointing a finger at you. We're not asking you to cold call anybody. We're not asking you to go out and witness to strangers, quote unquote. We're asking you to begin with people that you already know. Who in your life can you begin to share your story and God's story with? And if that's something that comes natural to you and you want to expand from there, you can. But for each of us, we're all called to share God's love, God's good news with those that we have within our sphere of influence, our relationships. And if it ends there, if that is as far as it goes, then we have been good and faithful servants. If you're an extrovert or you're just a gifted evangelist and this comes really easy for you, you can begin to think beyond that, looking at the surrounding neighborhood and other opportunities that may come along. But still, some of you may be asking, what does it actually look like to share God's good news with somebody else? And so I'd like to use a strange example for you. Several years ago, the theologian, philosopher, and pundit Cornel West was on the Craig Ferguson late night show. And the interview was so unique, I had to grab it and show it to you as some fodder for conversation of what good news sharing conversations can look like. So take a look. So I want to bring to you all a couple questions in regards to the nature of this conversation. Did you notice that Cornel West comes into the conversation with Craig Ferguson already aware of several things about Craig Ferguson? Did you notice that he had done a little bit of research? He had noticed some things he knew that Ferguson had recently written a memoir. He congratulated him on his recent performance at Carnegie Hall. He knew something about his Scottish background and talked about how his own background and narrative may have some resonance with his own experiences and the impulses of the gospel. How did he respond when Ferguson pushed back on some of the adverse or shadow side of religion and Christianity in particular? Did anybody remember that? Rhonda, I think you've got your hand up.
Yes, that's what I was going to say to begin with. He wasn't really talking about religion. He was talking about Jesus, about love, and he boiled it all down. I do believe there's a an important role for organized religion. But places like Europe have the worst possible history with it, where it was co-opted by society. And so, it doesn't have a very good reputation. But it was enlightening that he just talked about love.
Yeah.
Over
Yeah.
and over and over. Love in jazz, love in Ferguson's very funny honesty.
Yes.
He did, touch on the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
But your ritual can be singing happy birthday Jesus on a cake at Christmas dinner. It can be whatever your family or your friends. So yeah, just talk about love.
Yeah. And share from your own personal experiences. Susan, you had your hand up.
One of the things that struck me at several occasions, and I can't really be specific about them, but he talked a lot about how for him religion was a flow. It changed, it evolved, and it wasn't always exactly one hard set experience or what have you. There were things that were always evolving and changing in his perspective and in the way he was greeting his religion of love. And I did pick up on the love theme all the way through.
Yeah. There's a humility from my perception of the conversation. There's a humility in his perspective, realizing he's not coming at this, even though he's an incredibly intelligent, educated individual. He recognizes he doesn't know everything, but this is what his experience is at this point, and what he sees at this moment, at this time. If you don't have your chat window up, friends, Debbie had a good comment in there, so you should check that out. And Carl, you have your hand up.
Yeah, he talked about love, but he also talked about it in context of something larger, something bigger, something much larger than that. Because I think sometimes when we talk about loving one another, that's just an ethic, just a thing to do. It's a thing. There is action, but there is a spirituality. I mean, it's the two greatest commandments to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So those two are in context with each other. Otherwise, Jesus would have just said, "Hey, love one another."
Yeah, right.
There's a larger context that Cornell pointed to as well. It wasn't just love, 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 but it was in love in context of the larger reality that we do, and therefore his rituals were helping him, even though they're limited, helping him move to a much larger reality, and then encompassing and seeing us all in that, not just me, but everyone in that context. And I thought the other thing that I thought was interesting is this parallel between certainty and joyness and despair. And I found it interesting that the one symbol, archetype, or however you want to say that, is the cross, in that holding those optimism and despair in the same reality.
Ooh,
So to me that points us, that helps us move into that. I'm just happy because I'm Christian. I'm just happy because I'm a Christian. It's there's this despair and this real, because if we don't understand despair, how are we going to understand the other?
It's a great point, Carl. I agree. I love the fact that he's able to hold on to doubt and despair in this conversation. He's not just saying like, no, it's all, happiness and good times with Jesus, that we can have those moments in the shadows as well. I agree. I'm right there with you. Judy.
Yeah, one of the things that also I saw with that is he was sincere. and
Mhm.
there was relationship building and understanding and acceptance of their differences. And because, like you said, he had done his research, he knows that more than likely Craig has come from an Anglican background and it's completely different than the Baptist, but he was understanding and had done that and was being a friend and being in relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's so much an integral part of our lives, and we need to do that too.
100%. Especially, that's great, Judy. And particularly in a time and place where the church does not have the prominence nor the trust of the greater population that it once had in a different era. For us to have the capacity to emulate the kind of conversational flow when we are talking about our story of God with God and God's story in the world with others, I think this is a wonderful example for us to riff off of, to use his language. One more comment, and then we're going to keep going because we have so much to try to talk about in a short amount of time. Carl.
Well, Judy kind of led me to think about the fact that I think there was an equalness to them,
Yes.
and I think so much evangelism is about me fixing you because you are lost and because you don't have the good news. There's something wrong with you, so therefore I'm going to fix you. And because I'm called upon by God himself to fix you. And I think that Cornell and Ferguson I don't think Cornell saw Ferguson as someone he needed to fix, someone he needed to save. He saw them as an equal partner to the strip we call humanity.
And even with that, at the end of the conversation, what is one of the last things Ferguson says? If that's what it is, I'm in. He subscribes to the idea of what it means to follow Jesus in that conversation. Anyways, this was such an incredible example of the kind of evangelism I think we are called to, that I just happened to catch one sleepless night on TV. I have always thought, gosh, this is a great example for the kind of conversations we can have. Brian McLaren once wrote that we need to stop counting conversions and start counting conversations. How can we begin to be in conversation with more people about where we are seeing God at work in the world, not in ways that seek to manipulate or control or guilt other people, but just simply announce God's love and demonstrate God's love. So let's go back to where we were a moment ago in thinking about how we share God's good news. As I mentioned, we're starting with thinking about who is it that we know. And maybe this is something that you want to contemplate, meditate on for a moment. Who is it that is in my sphere that I can have conversations with? Again, these don't have to be forced or fabricated. They can be natural conversations where, as we become more practiced at this, it becomes more and more natural. And one of the best ways we can do to gain some insight into where opportunities might be is to simply begin to pray for others. C.S. Lewis said, I pray because I'm helpless. I pray because the need flows out of me all the time, waking and sleeping. It doesn't change God, it changes me. This is what the examen prayer practice does, is it begins to change how we see our lives and where we see God's activity around it, and therefore begin to see opportunities to talk about where God is at work in the world with those that we love and care for in our lives. So the first thing we want to do is begin to observe in our personal context what is going on in the lives of those people, just like Cornell West had done, that he observed some of the things in going on in Craig Ferguson's life and in his background, being curious about those things, wondering, I wonder what's going on there. What's all of that about, right? And then after that, noticing where God's good news is showing up in that experience of someone else. You're probably going to want to do about 70% of the listening and 30% of the talking. That's what it requires to be observant, noticing, and curious about what God is doing in the lives of other people in our context. Now, for those of us that feel like, got it, I've got my list of those that I love and care for in my life, I'm ready to begin to think about other people. Well, then you can begin to look at a little bit wider sphere, those people in the neighborhood. And the first question you need to ask yourself is, well, which neighborhood are we talking about? Are we talking about the church's neighborhood, the area around the church that you worship with, or yours? Neither of these are exclusive of the other. It isn't that one of these is a better answer than the other. Either of them can be where you choose to answer this question. But who's in the neighborhood? Have you walked through that neighborhood or driven through that neighborhood, spent time paying attention to what's going on there to generate some curiosity, meet people and get to see some familiar faces, and then begin with who you've already met? Maybe it's somebody that you've seen a few different times and had some minimal encounters, but it's time to get curious and observe what else might be going on there. We do on our diocesan website have a whole bunch of tools for doing this work. If these are practices, particularly around the larger neighborhood, whether that be your neighborhood or the neighborhood around the parish, we've got a bunch of resources on the website that you can use for getting to know the surrounding neighborhood better. But if we're noticing where God's news is showing up in the lives of others, the next thing is to share what we are observing. What are you noticing about where God is at work in the surrounding neighborhood? I want to share actually an example with you about this. There was somebody that I had seen almost on a daily basis in my life, but had not actually had much of a conversation with them, but be in passing, and that was the crossing guard at my kids' school. Almost on a daily basis, I would take my kids to school before I would then head off to work. And every day I would have very short experiences with the crossing guard. And the crossing guard at my kids' school, when they were in middle school, was a ferocious crossing guard. This crossing guard would get in front of a speeding semi-truck if it was to save her babies. Like if her kids crossing the road, that intersection was hers. And so I remember one opportunity when I was standing there and waiting for traffic to give us an opportunity to cross the street and chit-chatting with her. And finally, I felt that little nudge. And I said, ma'am, whenever I'm at this corner with you as our crossing guard, I kind of have this image in my mind of the story of the Good Shepherd in the Gospels. Have you ever heard that story? And she had, but she had never heard somebody compare her to the Good Shepherd. And we had this whole conversation about what it is to be someone that really cares for the vulnerable and looks out for that last one that needs to be cared for and taken to safety on the other side of the street, so on and so forth. And it really was this wonderful conversation where she wasn't invited to church. She wasn't invited to say a prayer, but in that moment, she had somebody demonstrate that there was good news in how she operated in the world, and that there was something about God's story wrapped up in how she moved throughout her daily work that she dearly cared for and was obvious. So we share what we observe with people, but we are not preachy or prescriptive. This isn't an opportunity, as Carl was pointing out, to wag our finger at people and say, well, you know what you should do, or what you could have done. This is our opportunity to observe where God is at work in their lives, or where we see analogies with our experiences within our own lives. And that leads me to the next one, where we begin to share our own experiences. We say, hey, here's an experience in my life, like my story of the Good Shepherd, which I learned in church, and how it relates to how I see you operate in the world. I see you acting like I see Jesus acting in scriptures. So we share our own experiences. And if the opportunity arises, invite them to something. Maybe something at your church, a small group, a Bible study, a prayer group, or even to church on Sunday morning. Because you know what, friends? The good news is announced every week at your church. This is what happens when we come to the table. The good news of Jesus is announced every single time. And I have somebody else who has an opinion on this to share a little bit of a story from from our presiding bishop. Here's a story about how he perceives the good news in the Eucharist service. Any thoughts? Comments?
I happen to have heard this story from Bishop Curry before he was presiding bishop, when he was the Bishop of North Carolina. I was at a Curcio meeting and heard that story, and it was so moving to know how impactful that could be, and how Eucharist is so important and can touch people in such a way that you don't even know.
Yeah. I agree, Judy. I think our inclination is to think that church, as we experience it, is something that only those of us that have been in this for a while can appreciate what God is doing there. And I think that it is probably, that might be the most incorrect assumption of what's going on in our churches. It is a beautiful opportunity to demonstrate to the world the good news of God. And so, so there you have it from the presiding bishop. This is the power of the good news shared in our worship. And so I hope you'll begin to think about sharing that with others by having conversations with them and sharing with them how you see God at work in the world through your own life and in the lives of others, and then even inviting folks to come and join you at church at some point. So from there, let's talk a little bit with the limited time that we have left. Actually, we're a little over time already. What's the homework for this coming week? Because yes, you're going to have homework. So the first thing that I'm inviting you to do this week is to have a one-on-one conversation with someone. Following the guide that we had in this week's conversations of doing about 70% of the listening, 30% of the talking, but just having a natural conversation as Cornell West and Craig Ferguson did, but where you're paying attention to where God may be at work and where you can begin to have conversations like that with those. You want to do that with a personal friend or a neighbor, either around the church or in your particular neighborhood. And if appropriate, when appropriate, invite them to church. Doesn't have to be to worship, although I think that is a more than sufficient place to invite somebody. But it can be a Bible study, it can be a social gathering, whatever it may be. But if the opportunity arises, consider inviting them to church. And part of the reason why I'm asking you to do this is because this is often so uncomfortable for us. And we only get better at it when we practice it, which leads me to something else that I want to make sure I bring to your attention. If you are subscribed to our newsletter, you probably saw that we announced in our newsletter this week the Invite a Friend to Church Sunday that we are encouraging congregations to participate in this fall. So I'm hoping that all of you will be willing participants in helping your congregations get ready for Invite a Friend to Church Sunday, whichever Sunday you choose in the fall to have that at your church. The article is on our website, so you can take a look at it there. And there's a great tutorial or checklist at edsd.org/invite of the different practices that your congregation can engage in during Invite a Friend to Church Sunday. So again, the homework for this week, have a one-on-one conversation with someone and invite someone to church if you can, and it feels appropriate for in that relationship. We will have we'll have a recording of this video as well as everything else related to this, an examen example, and links to all of the other tools that we've discussed this evening on the Evangelism 101 page. So you'll have that, and I will send out an email after this call so that you can have that in your inbox as well.